Barron Trump sat silently in the plush first-class cabin of a commercial airplane, gazing out at the runway. The evening sun cast its golden rays over the tarmac, painting the scene with an almost dreamlike serenity. Around him, the hum of boarding passengers filled the air, a background noise of luggage wheels, quiet conversations, and the occasional announcement from the intercom. Barron seemed untouched by the bustle around him. His mind was elsewhere, his tall frame relaxed in the oversized seat, his hands resting gently on the armrest. The cabin, though busy, carried an air of exclusivity and calm befitting its first-class status. Well-dressed passengers stowed their carry-ons in overhead bins and exchanged polite smiles with the crew. Barron, however, remained still, immersed in his own thoughts. His young, yet composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the often hurried energy of boarding a flight. The tranquil moment was shattered when a loud and authoritative voice broke through the low hum. "Excuse me, but what is he doing here?" barked the pilot, his words slicing through the air like a knife. The sudden aggression caught everyone's attention, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The pilot stood at the entrance to the first-class section, his glare fixed on Barron. His voice carried more than just curiosity. It was sharp, accusatory, and unmistakably hostile. Barron turned toward the source of the disturbance, his calm expression momentarily faltering into one of mild confusion. The passengers around him froze, their eyes darting between Barron and the pilot, trying to piece together the unfolding. Some leaned back in their seats, while others craned their necks to get a better view, their whispers blending into a collective "Is there a problem, sir?" Barron asked, his voice steady but laced with a hint of his question, though simple, hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the pilot to clarify his. The pilot's sneer deepened as he stepped closer, his hand gesturing toward Barron's seat as if it were evidence in a case he was building. "Yes, there is a problem," he declared. "People like you don't belong here. This is first class, not some charity." The audacity of the statement sent a ripple through the cabin. A collective gasp broke out among the passengers, who exchanged shocked glances. The accusation wasn't just about the seat. It carried undertones that were hard to ignore. Barron's heart sank, though not out of personal. He was no stranger to scrutiny and judgment, but this attack felt deeper, uglier something, rooted in prejudice rather than protocol. Despite the weight of the confrontation, Barron maintained his composure. He straightened in his seat, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. "I have a ticket for this seat," he said firmly. "I belong here as much as anyone." The pilot, however, He crossed his arms and tilted his head as if unimpressed by Barron's response. "We'll see about that," he said dismissively, before storming off toward the cockpit. His departure left a trail of unease in the cabin, the tension hanging like a dark cloud. Passengers resumed whispering, their words now colored with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some reached for their phones, ready to record the escalating situation. An elderly woman sitting nearby leaned toward Barron and whispered, "Are you okay, young man?" Her tone was warm, her concern genuine. Barron nodded and offered her a polite smile, grateful for the small gesture of kindness in the midst of growing hostility. As Barron settled back into his seat, he noticed the subtle but anxious glances from the surrounding passengers. Though he remained outwardly calm, his mind raced. This wasn't just an ordinary encounter. Something about the pilot's hostility didn't add up, and Barron couldn't shake the feeling that the incident was far from over. Unbeknownst to the passengers, this was only the beginning of a confrontation that would challenge not just Barron, but the very fabric of the cabin's fragile calm. The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable as the pilot, clad in his uniform, loomed over Barron Trump with an air of authority that bordered on aggression. His sharp tone had already cut through the once serene atmosphere, leaving passengers frozen in their seats, unsure of how to respond to the unfolding confrontation. "Excuse me, but what is he doing?" The pilot had barked moments earlier, his glare fixed solely on Barron, as if his presence alone was enough. Barron, seated near the window, looked up, his expression calm but confused. He had done nothing to draw attention to himself, yet now he found himself at the center of Around him, passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering quietly while others simply stared, their eyes darting between the pilot and the young man who had suddenly become the focus of unwanted scrutiny. "Is there a problem, sir?" Barron asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension. His calm response only seemed to aggravate the pilot. The older man's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his stance rigid and accusatory. "Yes, there is a problem," the pilot retorted, his tone dripping with disdain. "People like you don't belong here. This is first class, not some charity." The cabin collectively gasped at the overt hostility in the pilot's words. It was not just what he said, but how he said it, a tone that carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something uglier than mere annoyance. The other passengers, though initially silent, began murmuring among themselves, their discomfort. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene, sensing that this encounter was far from ordinary. Barron's heart sank at the pilot's words, though not for himself. He had faced judgment and criticism his entire life, and this was not. What struck him, however, was the sheer venom in the pilot's tone and the implications behind his accusation. This wasn't just about a seat or a ticket. It was personal, targeted, and meant to humiliate. "I have a ticket for this seat," Barron said firmly, his voice measured but resolute. His statement hung in the air, a calm assertion of his right to be there. The pilot, however, was unmoved. He sneered, crossing his arms as he addressed the cabin, as if seeking validation for his act. "This flight doesn't leave until he's out of this cabin," he declared, pointing at Barron like a judge delivering it. The older woman seated nearby, who had already shown concern for Barron, spoke up softly but firmly. "Young man, are you all?" she asked again, her voice a small but vital gesture of support in the midst of the rising tension. Barron nodded, offering her a faint smile, though his mind was racing. The pilot, undeterred, turned on his heel and stormed off toward the cockpit, leaving behind a wake of discomfort and passengers whispered more openly now, their voices blending into a chorus of unease. Some were clearly sympathetic toward Barron, while others seemed hesitant, unsure of how to react or whether they should enter. Moments later, a young flight attendant approached Barron cautiously. Her face betrayed a mixture of nervousness and concern. Leaning down slightly, she whispered, "Sir, is everything all right? I overheard what the captain said. If you'd prefer, I can see about moving you to another." Barron looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before replying softly but firmly. "Thank you." The flight attendant nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing her face, but the unease in her demeanor remained. She straightened and hurried back down the aisle, leaving Barron alone to face the increasingly tense atmosphere of the cabin. Minutes later, the intercom crackled to life, the pilot's voice filling the cabin once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we're experiencing there's a security concern we need to address." His words, though vague, carried a clear implication, and the murmurs among the passengers grew loud. Barron froze, the pieces falling into place. The pilot wasn't just being rude, he was escalating the situation, attempting to paint Barron as the calculated hostility was a tactic, a way to justify his actions in the eyes of the passengers and the air. The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point as passengers whispered, glanced at Barron, and speculated about the so-called security concern. A man seated across the aisle leaned forward, his voice a mix of curiosity and unease. "Is he talking about you?" he asked quietly. Barron didn't answer. Instead, he calmly reached for his phone and opened the camera app, preparing to document what he knew was only the beginning of a confrontation that would test not just his composure, but the integrity of everyone on board. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavier with each passing moment. Barron Trump sat quietly in his seat, his demeanor calm but his mind racing. The pilot's earlier outburst still lingered in the air, casting a shadow over the cabin. Passengers whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Barron, unsure of what to make of the unfolding drama. The crackle of the intercom cut through the murmurs, commanding everyone's attention. The pilot's voice, firm but laced with barely concealed hostility, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we're experiencing a delay. There's a security concern we need to address." Barron froze. "A security concern?" His stomach tightened as the weight of the accusations sank in. The pilot was escalating the situation, framing Barron as a threat to justify his behavior. Around him, the passengers' whispers grew louder, their tones shifting from curiosity to alarm. A man across the aisle leaned toward Barron, his expression a mixture of concern and apprehension. "Is he talking about you?" he asked cautiously. Barron didn't reply. Instead, he reached for his phone, opening the camera app. If this situation spiraled further out of control, he wanted to ensure there was a record of everything. Moments later, the cabin doors opened, and 2 airport security officers stepped onto the plane. Their presence immediately amplified the passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their whispers now audible murmurs of unease. The officers moved deliberately down the aisle, their eyes scanning the passengers until they stopped directly in front of Barron. "Sir," one of them said, his tone professional but firm, "we need you to come with us." Barron looked up at the officers, his tall frame still seated, his expression composed. "Can I ask why?" he inquired calmly. "We've been informed of a potential issue," the officer replied vaguely, avoiding specifics. The cabin fell silent, every eye now fixed on the confrontation. Some passengers looked outraged, others merely stunned. But then, a voice broke through the uneasy quiet. "This is ridiculous," an elderly woman exclaimed. It was the same woman who had spoken to Barron earlier. She stood up, her face flushed with indignation. "That boy hasn't done anything wrong. I saw the whole thing. It's the pilot who's out of line." Her outburst emboldened others. A man in a business suit spoke up, his voice firm. "I've been sitting here the entire time. He's done nothing but mind his own business." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the passenger's vocal. One spoke into his radio, seeking guidance, while the other hesitated, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of dozens of watchful eyes. Barron, meanwhile, remained composed, though his heart pounded. He wasn't shaken by the false accusations themselves she had faced worse. What moved him was the unexpected solidarity of the strangers around him. They didn't owe him anything, yet they refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. But even as the passengers rallied behind him, Barron knew the situation was far from resolved. The pilot had made his intentions clear, and his actions seemed driven by something more than mere protocol. Barron could feel the weight of the moment, sensing that whatever was coming next would be decisive not just for him, but for everyone on board. The first-class cabin buzzed with tension as 2 airport security officers stood before Barron Trump, asking him to leave the plane. The pilot's earlier accusations had framed Barron as a security concern, heightening the unease among the passengers. However, the cabin's mood began to shift as voices of dissent rose from the seats around. "This is ridiculous," exclaimed an older woman seated nearby, her voice cutting through the silence. She stood, her posture defiant and her cheeks flushed with, "That boy hasn't done anything wrong. I've been watching him the entire time. It's the pilot who's out of line." Her tone carried a firm conviction, and her words reverberated throughout the cabin, drawing the attention of both passengers and crew. Barron, still seated, turned toward her, a faint but grateful smile on his lips. Despite the hostility he had endured, the woman's courage and compassion offered him a flicker. The older woman's outburst emboldened others. A man in a sharp business suit, seated a few rows away, stood up and chimed in. "She's right," he said, his tone "I've been sitting here the entire time. This young man has done nothing but mind his own business. If anyone's causing a problem, it's not him, it's the pilot." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had previously remained silent now voiced their support. Some nodded in agreement, while others began speaking up, their words echoing the sentiments of the older woman and the businessman. The 2 security officers exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the straightforward situation they had anticipated. They had been called to address a security concern, but now they were faced with an unexpected uprising from the passengers, who were openly challenging the pilot's act. The woman, emboldened by the growing support around her, took a step closer to the officers. "You're making a mistake," she said firmly. "This young man has a right to be here. If anyone should be escorted off this plane, it's the pilot for abusing his authority." The businessman nodded in agreement, folding his arms. "She's right," he added. "We've all seen what's happened here. The pilot's behavior is completely unacceptable." Barron remained seated, his tall frame exuding a calm resilience. Though he wasn't used to being defended by strangers, he was deeply moved by their willingness to speak. These people who owed him nothing were standing up against injustice not because they had to, but because they knew it was the right thing to do. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, blending into a collective voice of dissent. Some passengers pulled out their phones, recording the scene or live streaming it, ensuring that the confrontation was documented. Their actions added another layer of pressure, as the security officers and crew now had to contend with the court of public opinion. The older woman turned to Barron, her voice softening but remaining firm. "Don't you let them push you around," she said. "You have every right to be here, and we're not going to let them treat you like that." Barron nodded, gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady, despite the chaos. As the support for Barron swelled, the balance of power in the cabin shifted. The passengers, united in their outrage, had transformed the dynamic. What began as a one-sided accusation had become a collective stand against the pilot's behavior, leaving the crew and security in a delicate position. The cabin buzzed with energy, the passengers' solidarity an unspoken message. They would not tolerate injustice. For the first time since the ordeal began, Barron felt the weight of the situation lift. He wasn't alone in this fight, and that made all the difference. The first-class cabin, now buzzing with tension and growing solidarity among the passengers, seemed to have turned against the pilot. Yet, despite the clear opposition from those on board, the pilot refused to relent. His earlier accusations and attempt to frame Barron Trump as a security threat had already backfired, but instead of de-escalating, the pilot's resolve hardened. His persistence was like a storm cloud, refusing to dissipate, casting an oppressive shadow over the cabin. The crackle of the intercom interrupted the murmurs of the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot's voice rang out, tense and filled with barely concealed anger. "I want to apologize for the earlier disruption, but let me remind everyone that rules exist for a reason. Some people think they're above them, but they're not." The thinly veiled jab sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Barron, seated and calm on the surface, clenched his jaw as the words hung in the air. Around him, passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the pilot's antagonistic tone reigniting their frustration. Then, the unexpected happened. The cockpit door swung open with a loud bang, slamming against the wall and silencing the cabin. The pilot emerged, his face flushed with rage, his movements erratic. All eyes turned to him as he stormed down the aisle, his gaze locked on Barron. The tension in the cabin reached its peak as gasps and whispers filled the air. "You think you're untouchable," the pilot sneered as he approached Barron, his voice low but venomous. "Think again." Barron, seated but composed, slowly stood, his towering frame forcing the pilot to stop just short of him. The air between them crackled with intensity as Barron met the pilot's gaze. "Is there something you'd like to say directly to me?" Barron asked, his tone calm but firm, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. The pilot, clearly unprepared for Barron's directness, faltered momentarily but quickly regained his composure. "You're causing a disturbance," he said. "This flight isn't going anywhere until you're off this plane." A chorus of voices erupted from the passengers. "This is absurd," shouted the older woman who had earlier defended Barron. "He's done nothing wrong." "Leave him alone," added the businessman, his voice firm and commanding. The pilot's gaze darted to the passengers, but their collective outrage seemed only to fuel his anger. "I don't care what any of you think. This is my plane, and I decide who stays and who goes." The tension in the cabin had reached a fever pitch. Passengers whispered anxiously, their gazes darting between Barron Trump, the visibly frustrated pilot, and the security officers standing awkwardly nearby. The pilot's earlier outbursts and relentless attempts to single out Barron had created an atmosphere thick with unease. Though Barron had remained composed, the situation was escalating rapidly, and the stakes were higher than ever. Then, a voice broke through the rising chaos, firm and commanding. "That's enough." All heads turned toward the back of the cabin, where an elderly man stood. His weathered face bore the marks of a life lived with integrity and courage, and his presence alone seemed to command respect. The passengers quieted, their collective attention now focused on the elderly veteran as he made his way forward. "You've gone too far," the man said, his deep voice steady but sharp. He planted himself firmly between Barron and the pilot, his back straight and his stance unyielding. Your behavior is not just unprofessional, it's disgraceful. The pilot, momentarily taken aback by the man's boldness, scowled.
This is none of your concern,
He snapped. It became my concern the moment you started abusing your authority, the veteran replied, his voice unwavering. This young man hasn't done a thing wrong. I've been watching him, and so has everyone else. If anyone's causing a disturbance on this plane, it's you. The passengers, emboldened by the veteran's courage, began to voice their agreement.
He's right.
Someone shouted from the back.
We've had enough of this.
The older woman who had earlier defended Barron stood again, her voice rising with conviction. You've treated him like a criminal without a shred of evidence. We won't stand for it. The businessman, still seated but clearly fed up, chimed in.
Your job is to ensure a safe and pleasant flight.
Not to harass paying passengers. If anyone should be removed from this plane, it's you. The pilot's face reddened as he looked around, realizing he was losing control of the situation. The passengers' voices grew louder, their outrage building into a wave of collective defiance. Phones were raised high, recording every word, every gesture, every moment of the unfolding confrontation. You think you can threaten me with your videos? The pilot sneered, his voice cracking under the pressure. I've done nothing wrong. You've done everything wrong, the veteran shot back. And you've underestimated the power of people standing together. At that moment, the lead flight attendant stepped forward, flanked by two of her colleagues. Her expression was calm but resolute. Captain, she said firmly, this has gone far enough. You're creating a disturbance and jeopardizing the safety of this flight. We need you to return to the cockpit immediately. The pilot turned to her, his jaw clenched. We're siding with what's right, she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. And if you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to report this incident to the airline and federal authority. The cabin erupted in applause. The passengers' cheers were loud and defiant, a collective declaration that they would no longer tolerate the pilot's behavior. Realizing he had no support left, the pilot snarled in frustration. Fine, he spat. Let him stay, but this isn't. He stormed back toward the cockpit, slamming the door behind. The tension in the cabin began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief and solidarity. The veteran turned to Barron, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You handled yourself well, son, he said. Don't let people like him get to. Barron nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes. Thank you, he said quietly. I couldn't have done it without all. As the flight continued, the passengers rallied around Barron, offering words of support and encouragement. The young woman who had recorded the incident uploaded the footage, and within minutes, it began to go viral. By the time the plane touched down, the story had spread across social media, with hashtags like Stand with Barron and Justice in the Skies trending worldwide. When the plane landed, the passengers were greeted by a crowd of reporters and supporters gathered at the terminal. News outlets had picked up the story, and the footage of the incident had sparked a global conversation about power, prejudice, and standing up to injustice. Barron stepped off the plane, flanked by the veteran and the older woman who had been among the first to defend him. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, their voices carrying a message of unity and resilience. A reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand.
Yeah.
Barron, what do you have to say about what happened on the flight? Barron paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice steady and clear. This isn't just about me, it's about standing up to injustice. No matter where it happened, no one deserves to be treated like they're less than human. We're all in this. The crowd responded with thunderous applause, their support echoing through the terminal. Later that evening, Barron sat in his hotel room, scrolling through countless messages of encouragement and solidarity. The incident had sparked not just outrage, but also hope, a reminder that ordinary people could come together to challenge authority and demand accountability. As Barron reflected on the day's events, he realized that the confrontation had been about more than just a seat on a plane. It had been a moment of reckoning, a chance to stand firm in the face of prejudice and inspire others to do the same. The veteran's words echoed in his mind. Bullies thrive on fear, but courage can bring them down. Barron knew the fight against injustice wasn't over, but he also knew that the strength and unity of ordinary people had the power to change the world. As he closed his eyes, a profound sense of clarity washed over him. Sometimes, the most unexpected battles lead to the most meaningful victory, and in those moments, standing up even when it's hard can make all the difference.